Thank you. It's 9 a.m. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the teleconference meeting of the Transportation Committee for Thursday, August 26, 2021. Before we begin, please note the meeting is being recorded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Thank you. Starting with Director Hill.
Present.
Thank you. Director Maston.
Here.
Director Melgar. Absent Director Rabbit. Absent Director Rodoni.
Present.
Thank you. Director Snyder.
Present.
Vice Chair Arnold. Absent. Chair Frederick.
Present.
Present. And President Parr.
Present.
Present. Thank you. Also on the line, you have Directors Cochran, Garbarino, Hernandez, and Terrio. So you are a committee of the whole. There are 10 people on the line. I'm going to confirm staff on the line really quickly. Dennis Mulligan.
Present.
Dwyer.
Yes.
Thank you. Eva Barr-Furbish.
Present.
Thank you. And today we have Madeline Chun.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Steve Miller? Not on the line. Mona Babauta?
Present.
Thank you. Jim Swindler? Is absent. Kelly Hopper?
Good morning.
Thank you. That confirms staff on the line.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I would like to remind the public that comment for items not on the agenda will be heard as agenda item number 7. I'd like to remind everyone to mute their phones until after the staff's presentation, and remember to unmute when we open up for director discussion. After staff's presentation, I'll be asking for any comments or questions on the item. If there are questions, the Secretary or I will call on you accordingly. After the discussion, we will ask for any public comment on that item before moving on. Please follow along by referring to the page numbers located on the bottom right corner of your meeting packet pages. We'll start the agenda this morning with item number 3, the reports of the district's accessibility, bus, and ferry advisory committees. That report, which includes agendas and minutes of the meetings, is on page 3 to 9 in your packet. Are there any questions, comments from the directors on this item?
This is Barb. I'd just like to thank Jim for attending those meetings. I read those minutes and I noticed that he's an attendee, especially at the Bus Advisory Committee, and I believe it's the Accessibility Committee. Anyway, thank you, Director Maston. I think that's important that one of us show up.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for acknowledging that.
And I will add a ditto to it. Are there any further questions or comments? I am hearing none. That concludes the discussion on this item. Before we move on, is there anyone from the public wishing to speak on the item?
We have no speakers on this item.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. No action is required. It's an informational report. We'll now proceed to agenda item number 4. This is a slide presentation relative to the US 101 part-time transit lane feasibility study. The presentation starts on page 31 of your packet. Director of Planning Ron Downing will introduce the report. Mr. Downing, please begin.
Good morning, Chair Fredericks, members of the committee. Just to give you a little bit background, some of you recall there was a history in Marin of this project emerging in the mid-2000s, and it was called Bus on Shoulder. This is a concept that emerged in Minneapolis during the 1990s as a result of flooding conditions that required some transit priority, and they began using the shoulder lanes of the freeways as a bypass for regular traffic. Since then, it grew into a very extensive network in Minneapolis. Most of the freeways have these shoulder lanes in lieu of center median HOV lanes. The buses are able to move into these shoulder lanes when the traffic on the freeway drops below 35 miles an hour. And since the initial rollout in Minneapolis, these lanes were also found in Seattle, San Diego, Miami, Atlanta, and in New Jersey, and in the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland and Virginia. There was a citizen that came forward in the mid-2000s and contacted Supervisor Hal Brown in Marin and suggested that there would be an application for this in the Highway 101 corridor in Marin. I actually participated in a transit cooperative research program field review of Minneapolis's bus on shoulder lanes in 2007. We did a field review here in Marin in 2007 also with the CHP and Caltrans to look at the entirety of the 101 corridor. As many of you know, there are sections of Highway 101 between the Richardson Bay Bridge and Novato where there is simply no shoulder, not even a shoulder lane. So the amount of right-of-way was really, really limited. This topic came up again about 2017, 2018. Ray Santiago gave a presentation to the Transportation Committee back in 2018 that showed the limitations of a bus on shoulder lane within Marin in both directions on Highway 101. Since then, the topic has kind of been repackaged into part-time transit lanes. And TAM has received a grant to look at what was the most promising segment of the Highway 101 bus on shoulder concept and has narrowed it down to a section between Atherton Avenue and North San Pedro Road in the southbound direction in the mornings. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Derek Mcgill, the planning manager for the Transportation Authority of Marin, and he will give a little bit more background from the TAM perspective, and then Adam Dankberg from Kimley Horn will present the findings of the consultant analysis.
Thank you, Ron. This is Derek Mcgill, the Director of Planning at the Transportation Authority of Marin. Appreciate the time to present today to the Golden Gate Transportation Committee Board of Directors. Just to provide a little bit of additional background and detail from the TAM perspective on the origins of the study and the effort to date. Back in 2016, the Federal Highway Administration updated guidance for bus on shoulder applications countrywide, really highlighting the Minneapolis experience as described very well by Ron Downing a moment ago. During the development of that FHWA guidance, Caltrans District 4 management came out and conducted an additional field review with TAM staff in the northern portion of the county between Novato and San Rafael to go over the potential application of a bus on shoulder application within the Marin US 101 corridor. Based on that field survey and additional discussions amongst TAM staff and our board of directors, bus on shoulder facilities in northern Marin County were identified in our long-range planning document, the vision plan for Marin County, as a potential strategy to improve transit operations and manage demand on the US 101 in Marin County. Subsequently, after the adoption of that long-term planning document back in 2017, TAM applied for and received a $308,000 Caltrans planning grant to study the feasibility of bus on shoulder operations in the corridor and look at what ways could bus on shoulder address the limitations that were identified in the December 2017 presentation by Ray Santiago and Golden Gate staff to this transportation committee. In the summer of 2020, the work really began with the development of the feasibility study. And that feasibility study was focused on identifying the potential concept of operations, potential concept for identifying the specific travel markets that may benefit from operations of bus on shoulder in this corridor, as well as the benefits to both Marin Transit and Golden Gate services, as well as the cost and the impacts on the mixed flow travel lanes as part of a potential pilot program. TAM also wanted to understand how this bus on shoulder operations may fit into other planned improvements in the corridor to make sure that we were advancing any concept or discussing any concept in conjunction with efforts for Marin-Sonoma Narrows and State Route 37, as well as ramp metering efforts planned in the corridor. Since that time, since summer, Adam Dinkberg from Kimley Horn has been leading the development of the feasibility study on behalf of TAM, and he's here today to present some of the findings from the draft report that was released in June of 2021. So with that, please, Adam, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Derek. Good morning, everybody. This is Adam Dinkberg with Kimley Horn Associates. I have a presentation here starting on slide 31. So jumping in, slide 32, the goals of the project. I think Derek touched on them a little bit, but these are the goals of a part-time transit lane pilot program along the 101 corridor. Obviously, reducing travel times would be a key goal, but also improving transit reliability and thus improving transit competitiveness with automobiles. Equity is certainly an important goal for this project as well, to serve transit-dependent populations, as well as other goals to make transit more efficient in the corridor, improve throughput, and as well as consider both equity and safety with such a part-time transit lane project. Slide 33, the goal of this study, which is, as Derek and Ron mentioned, is a feasibility study to assess the feasibility of part-time transit lanes on the segment of 101. We assess the geometric suitability of the corridor for part-time transit lanes, develop concepts to potentially implement part-time transit lanes on this segment, identify the remaining steps for implementation of such a project, and prepared a highway system plan that looked at the relationship of part-time transit lanes to other projects. We did conduct outreach for this project to receive public input and engaged a TAC and a leadership team that involved a number of jurisdictions and transit operators and entities to coordinate and obtain feedback on each step of the process along the way. We had a very engaged TAC from all members and really appreciated their input and direction as we prepared project materials. Slide 34, this shows the study area that was highlighted already here. We were looking between San Marin Drive and the Santa Fe Transit Center as our initial study area for the potential for part-time transit lanes in the 101 corridor. Slide 35, basically we started with an analysis of the existing congestion condition in the corridor, looking at pre-COVID conditions. So primarily looking at fall of 2019 and early 2020 before the pandemic. As I'm sure you all are familiar, there's a lot of congestion, in particular in the morning period on 101, with an average delay of over 16 minutes in the southbound direction. While there are some periods of PM delay as well as delay in the northbound direction, those congestion periods are generally short and they're generally not recurring, which means that they occur in different locations, different times of day. Therefore, the benefits of part-time transit lanes in the southbound direction, the PM, or in the northbound direction, either time period, are generally minimal because in order for part-time transit lanes to be utilized, the speed needs to drop below 35 miles an hour. So therefore, as a result of that analysis, we really focused on the southbound direction, and in particular consider the southbound direction during the AM commute period for determination of the feasibility of part-time transit lanes. Congestion extends from nearly the entirety of the analysis segment, but not quite the full length. So it extends from roughly North San Pedro Road or just south of North San Pedro Road to DeLong Avenue in Novato. Slide 36, as a result of where this congestion occurs, as well as a review of geometric feasibility in this corridor, we identified a concept, again shown on slide 36. So this concept for part-time transit lanes leverages both the existing auxiliary lanes as well as the existing shoulder along 101. Where an auxiliary lane is currently present, the bus would use the auxiliary lane to travel between interchange ramps, and no additional modification or improvement or use of the shoulder is needed. Where the auxiliary lane is not present, the bus would use the part-time transit lane, which would be a restriping of the existing shoulder to allow bus use Because this is envisioned as a pilot, the focus would be on a signing and striping solution in the corridor that would indicate the use of the shoulder. The part-time transit lane would start around Novato Boulevard in Novato and then extend continuously to North San Pedro Road. South of North San Pedro Road, the bus would then merge back into the mainline lanes. This corridor is unique, the 101 corridor is unique in that it has inline bus stops at the freeway ramps. So the bus exits the freeway at each of these ramps, serves a bus stop located generally between the ramps, and then gets immediately back on the freeway. This concept would remain with the part-time transit lanes. Essentially, the part-time transit lanes actually help facilitate access to the bus by keeping the bus on the far right side of the highway as it travels between each interchange. Shown here in a couple of dashed orange lines are locations where restriping would be necessary. We did find in the southbound direction there is no major obstruction to use of the shoulder. There are some locations where the shoulder is not quite wide enough to provide for bus use. In those areas, we would do some restriping in order to widen the shoulder to that minimum width. But no structures would need to be modified and no significant widening of the highway would be needed. Slide 37 describes the operational scenarios. Part-time transit lanes would only be utilized when speeds on the main line drop below 35 miles an hour, which is, as you know, typical in the morning peak period. Buses would be limited to no more than 15 miles an hour above traffic, not to exceed 35 miles an hour. If there is some obstruction in the shoulder, whether it be enforcement or construction or maintenance or flooding, the buses would return to the main line and bypass that obstruction. We did also look at operation of the HOV lane, particularly during the morning congestion period. We found that the HOV lane performance actually degrades to be essentially equivalent to the main line during the peak of the AM peak period. Therefore, speeds in the HOV lane drop below 35 miles an hour as well. So it may be beneficial for Golden Gate Express bus service in this corridor to also use the part-time transit lane. Of course, they would need to merge over to the right-hand side to do so, and there could be some delay penalty associated with that, but the analysis indicated that there may be some travel time savings and reliability benefit from doing so. Slide 38 indicates the capital improvements that would be necessary to implement part-time transit lanes on this segment of the roadway. As I mentioned, the primary improvement would be limited shoulder widening through restriping or very minimal limited widening within the right-of-way on already level ground. We would implement static signing and markings along the corridor to indicate the use of the shoulder for transit only. There would also be additional CHP enforcement areas provided at select locations between interchanges where the shoulder use would be used by buses. There are a number of drop inlet grates along the way. Those would be modified and reinforced to allow for a smoother ride and reduce vehicle wear and tear. And there would be some locations where repaving would be necessary to provide a smoother ride or enhance the section. We do want to emphasize that this concept would not modify the inline station locations or how they are accessed, so the existing bus stop locations would remain with access in a similar fashion. Because the improvements are fairly minor, really primarily restriping, the total cost is in the $6 to $7 million range in current year dollars. And that includes both product development costs as well as implementation costs. There's currently no funding for future phases of this project, and TIM has plans to pursue grant funding for subsequent phases. Slide 39, we did a detailed quantitative analysis of potential benefits of part-time transit lanes in this corridor. These benefits include vehicle mile traveled and greenhouse gas reductions, primarily associated with potential for mode shift to transit by making transit more desirable, more competitive with autos. Because one of the biggest challenges in this corridor is bus reliability, the bus schedules have to provide a lot of buffer, as there is quite a bit of variability in traffic congestion on a day-to-day basis. By using part-time transit lanes where buses can consistently go at 35 miles an hour allows for a significant improvement in reliability, which then should allow for schedules to become more efficient and therefore allow for some modification of schedule to turn buses around faster or operate more service in this corridor or save operating costs. As I mentioned, some of the express buses could also benefit from part-time transit lanes in this corridor. For users, certainly a benefit for improved reliability as well as the just improved mobility option within the 101 corridor. One of the key benefits of this project is as an opportunity to serve as a part of the post-COVID transit recovery strategies consistent with the MCC Blue Ribbon Task Force and the goals and strategies identified by that task force to really help transit become more desirable and overcome what is expected to be continuing increasing congestion as travel behavior continues to rebound from COVID pandemic. Slide 40, this focuses on the specific equity benefits of part-time transit lanes. In general, transit service in the 101 corridor has a higher composition of its riders being minority or low-income riders than the general Marin County population. So therefore, any benefits to transit in this corridor does have equity benefits. We note here that the biggest benefits for part-time transit lanes are to the local routes that access each interchange and therefore are already on the right-hand side of 101. And those routes specifically have a very high component of minority and low-income populations, much, much greater than the general population. And those routes have the greatest benefit, as I mentioned. So there is a significant equity component to part-time transit lanes to benefit those populations most in need. Slide 41 just is a very high-level summary of the highway systems plan that was prepared and incorporated into the feasibility study. There are a number of other ongoing efforts within this corridor or adjacent corridors on 101. These include the Marin Sonoma Narrows widening project that would extend HOV lanes north of Novato, the ongoing effort to synchronize HOV hours of operation in this corridor, future ramp metering by Caltrans. It's noted that phase 1 of the ramp metering project is south of this corridor and does not affect this corridor. Phase 2 is within this segment of 101. However, phase 2 is quite a number of years out and would likely be beyond the time horizon of this pilot project. TAM is currently conducting a Highway 101 interchange and approaching roadway study that is looking at several key interchanges within this segment of 101, including areas such as ramp access as well as pedestrian and bicycle access to the bus stops along the way. So this project would really, the 101 interchange and approaching roadway study would really interface well with part-time transit lanes by making transit more accessible, and then the part-time transit lanes would then potentially benefit transit on the 101 corridor. And then finally, the SR37 corridor projects located on SR37, which have the potential to interface with 101 through expanded transit service in that corridor or additional HOV connections in that corridor. Slide 42, we do highlight a couple of the challenges or maybe upcoming opportunities associated with part-time transit lanes. The California Vehicle Code does not allow for enforcement of a part-time transit lane for public transit buses only. It really limits there's only a clause for all transit buses. And so that's a concern that's been raised by CHP throughout this process. The California legislator has introduced Assembly Bill 476, which is not currently being considered this year, but may be considered next year as part of the legislative session to establish a statewide pilot program for part-time transit lane implementation. And that would be expected to address some of the challenges within the California Vehicle Code and other processes. So that's something to keep an eye on and potentially apply for if that does become ultimately implemented. Caltrans has prepared draft design guidance on part-time transit lanes. However, they have not released it pending additional coordination with the California Highway Patrol as well as future action by the state legislature. So we look forward to the ultimate release of that design guidance, and then that certainly has the potential to update or refine the approach to implementation of part-time transit lanes in this corridor. Slide 43 identifies subsequent phase efforts. Again, this current effort is only a feasibility study, really identifying the geometric feasibility as well as benefits and costs of part-time transit lanes. There certainly would be a lot of work still to do in subsequent phases before the project could be implemented. These include identifying grant programs and funding sources to fund future phases, It's to refine the define the implementation process, in particular working with Caltrans to determine the approval process for part-time transit lanes. This would likely include a detailed safety analysis and performance monitoring plan to address stakeholder comments and concerns raised throughout this process. There may be an opportunity in Thurbo to leverage Senate Bill 288, which streamlines the environmental clearance process. And so we're mindful of a sunset date on SB 288 and the desire to continue to advance this project in the time frame currently authorized by 288 to help streamline the implementation process. The concept of operations is really a key component of a future phase. This would really define the operating plan and the performance monitoring components and the operating costs and communications protocols and roles and responsibilities and a lot of key elements of this project that have not yet been defined. So that would be a key future deliverable. San Diego is currently in the process of implementing a permanent part-time transit lane solution on 805. They have run pilots in the past, but they have just finished construction of part-time transit lanes on 805. So that's scheduled to open in the very near term. So that'll be a great opportunity for the state to monitor performance of that part-time transit lane and assess safety conditions and benefits provided by it. And so we would recommend staying abreast of lessons learned coming out of that project. And that concludes the presentation. So thank you for your time and certainly happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mcgill. Dennis, do you have anything to add to this item?
I just want to thank the team for their presentation this morning. Anything that gets transit out of traffic is welcome. It speeds up transit to make it more desirable, which is consistent with our equity goals and our greenhouse gas emission goals. So I just wanted to thank the presenters.
Thank you, Dennis. Are there any questions, comments, concerns from the directors on item 4?
This is Director Maston. I have some questions.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You answered most of my questions. I've got a couple just for clarification. So the 35 mile per hour speed, I assume, just refers to the PTTL lane. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in essence, the bus would only enter the part-time transit lanes when mainline speeds drop below 35 miles an hour, and the speed within the part-time transit lane would be capped at 35 miles an hour. So essentially, there'd be no value for the bus to use it until speeds drop below 35 miles.
Yeah. Okay. And will regular sweeping of the shoulder lane be included in the operating plan? Because there gets to be a lot of crap over there.
Yes, so we've identified some ongoing operating and maintenance costs that would be associated with part-time transit lanes. That would be one of them would be additional maintenance of the shoulder. Another would be additional freeway service patrol within the corridor to help clear stalled or broken down or abandoned vehicles. Additional enforcement of the part-time transit lane and the shoulder would be another anticipated additional cost. So yes, that would be a component of it as well. Okay.
And the CHP enforcement area, is that an area for CHP to pull vehicles out of traffic?
It's primarily envisioned as an area for CHP to wait out of the flow of the buses within the part-time transit lane. So typically today they would pull out on a ramp or a shoulder and kind of wait and observe traffic. We would want that activity to occur outside the part-time transit lane. So this would be primarily a waiting area. We would expect them to use the shoulder for enforcement or for moving stalled vehicles.
Okay, and then the my last question, AB 476. Do you think that will change the enforcement for public transit issue? Is that in there that you know of?
It's a bit unclear. I think that's the expectation, as CHP is really focused on that as a primary challenge for implementing part-time transit lanes throughout the state. So it's the expectation that it will address that. But as the bill is not currently being advanced this legislative session, it's a little unclear what form it'll ultimately take.
Right. Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Maston. Are there any further questions from board members?
This is Bert. Question.
Oh, all right. I heard two of you, but I heard Bert's name. Bert, why don't you continue?
Okay, thank you. Relative to AB 476, are there any local assembly members who have said they'll sponsor it?
This is Derek Mcgill with TAM. The status of AB 476 is a 2-year bill. We need to go back and check and see which local assembly members have expressed support at this point, where we don't have a tally of that handy for today's presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from our directors?
Yeah, this is Director Snyder. I had a question on in relation to Caltrans or construction work. I guess I haven't seen any downside in the presentation, but I have on occasion been in Sacramento, and we've had, I guess I would wonder what your response from Caltrans was. I know there's sign crews that are working sometimes, or fixing guardrails, and sometimes that's not always something that's pre-planned when there's a car accident. And I know that, for me, worker safety, road worker safety has been something I've worked on over my career, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that and what Caltrans' response was, and or even if there is construction, or how you would coordinate that when you have something tied to a speed limit. There's some unpredictability in especially alongside the road. Yeah, and we had Caltrans as a member of our TAC, and they were very engaged throughout the process. Caltrans headquarters is very supportive of part-time transit lane implementation throughout the state. That's what's motivated their design guidance documentation that will address things like safety and safe use of the corridor. We also had involvement with Caltrans District 4, including a meeting towards the latter stages of the project with the leadership from Caltrans District 4. They were very supportive of this project because it's really consistent with their, the direction they've received from the state in terms of prioritizing transit within the state highway system. So they were very supportive of this process. Certainly there will be some details to work out regarding communication and how to adjust for construction activity in the corridor. But from a policy standpoint, they were very supportive of part-time transit lanes. Was there any studies about increased fatality rates for construction workers alongside the road in like Minneapolis or any of the other places that have instituted this system? I have not come across any of those. I think certainly one factor is the speed limit limited to 35 miles an hour. Allows for additional reaction time, modification of route by the driver, and then also, really anytime there would be construction that would affect the shoulder, the bus would return back to the main line. But I'm not aware of any specific studies looking at construction worker safety related to part-time transit lanes.
This is Derek Mcgill with CAM again. There are very limited use cases that have occurred nationwide with part-time transit lanes, and so we don't have a huge safety or risk set of data to review. The San Diego Metropolitan Transportation System did conduct a safety evaluation of their initial pilot period and noted no incidents with the operations of their part-time transit lanes. It's important to note that the bus drivers on the public transit fleet are well trained, and I know in the North Bay we do have some very, very excellent drivers on both Line Transit and Golden Gate driver systems. And in the case of any construction activities or any auto breakdowns or vehicle incidents, the drivers have the ability to be notified via dispatch to exit the part-time transit lanes and remerge into the general purpose lanes. So it's a rather controlled environment with that trained population of drivers on public transit agencies that when incidents like that do occur, there is flexibility built into these types of concepts to just re-merge into traffic and utilize the existing mixed flow lanes.
I appreciate the responses, and it's a great, excellent presentation. Thank you for your time.
This is Barb.
Questions? Bert?
This is Barb.
Barb, please go ahead.
Barbara. This might be a naive question, but I know that's the corridor that I travel when I come to the bridge. And passenger cars are not very polite to the transit buses. Is that a nice way to put that? So if there's some sort of an emergency that the transit needs to go in and out of the passenger lane, are there studies that show how they manage to do that without losing more time than they've gained being in a transit lane? And maybe it's just awareness on the part of the passenger cars, but that's what I notice. They're not very polite.
Thank you, Barbara. Is there a response to that implied question?
I'm not aware of any studies on the merging activity. I will note that the part-time transit lanes would only be utilized where speeds, drop and are very slow on the main line. And so, as a result, there's actually quite a bit of potential savings for bypassing that congestion. So while maybe, there may be some delay for the bus to merge back in, we would expect over the long distance of the part-time transit lane that there would still be a net benefit. But yes, that is something that would have to be factored in, would be the bus merging back into the main line.
All right. Are there any further comments or questions from the directors?
This is Director.
I'm sorry, sort yourselves out.
Go ahead,
I was
Mike.
Director Terrio on one hand. I don't know who the other was.
All right. Director Terrio said he'll wait for the other person who wants to speak. Who wants to speak?
Well, it's Director Rabbit, and I appreciate that, and I'll be quick. Thank you for the presentation. The first I heard of the PTTL was really with Assemblymember Levine as a quick fix to the Narrows and where the HOV lanes were not yet constructed. Are there other examples of bus on shoulder situations with HOV lanes? And the average AM delay within the presentation, is that in the block of traffic or is that in the HOV lanes? And was there anything within all of the studying about, I think something that our general manager has always talked about was, increasing the number of occupants for the HOV lane to increase the speeds therein? Or are we talking about two separate opportunities for bus transit?
I'll try and address that first. There's a couple of questions in there. Let's see. So in terms of the travel time savings, that it was for the mainline traffic flow. So the 16 minutes, that was the mainline travel. We did note that during the peak of the peak, the HOV lane does degrade to have a similar level of delay. Essentially, the HOV lane does perform better than the main line in the shoulders of the peak period, but during the peak of the peak period, it's very similar to the main line. So it would be a similar benefit at the peak of the peak for HOV lanes, but we were mindful of the range of transit services in this corridor, and that many of the local services are forced to remain on the right-hand side of the freeway because they're exiting and entering the freeway in multiple interchanges. And so we identified a clear benefit for those services, as well as a potential benefit for some of the express services that remain in the HOV lane. I think because of the different service types, we would view this as a suite of potential solutions in the corridor. And I would say that this would, part-time transit lanes would be a distinct solution strategy from modifying the HOV hours of operation or occupancy requirements. I think there's a first question that I missed, though. Sorry, if you could repeat.
Just if there's any other location where they have on shoulder with HOV?
Yes, it's a good question. So actually the San Diego implementation that is currently ongoing on 805, there is a HOV lane on that segment. And then I'll note just within the Bay Area, while there's no other existing part-time transit lane implementations, there are plans to pursue such the Dumbarton Bridge on by MST and Santa Cruz Metro on Highway 1, as well as by CCTA on I-680. And I-680 also does have an HOV or express lane on 680.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. And to kind of reiterate what Dennis said earlier, I think the key is getting bus transit moving faster in whichever lane they're going to be in to attract more ridership. So thank you for the presentation. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Director Rabbit. Director Terrio, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, actually. The first is related to Barbara's point. You've talked about the difficulty that buses may have in getting from the HOV lane over to the part-time transit lane. I would anticipate not just the situation that Barbara has described, but the other one when they have to eventually to exit the part-time transit lane and re-enter what will be very dense and slow traffic. Is there contemplated a paired sort of amendment to the vehicle code on a trial basis that would privilege the buses, require a yield by drivers to them at such points as that? I know that would involve signage and so on too, but I would just put that out there. The other question is, I know that emergency vehicles, highway patrol, fire, etc., will use the shoulder to bypass traffic when they have to get to a situation. And what has the highway patrol and other emergency agencies have had to say about that?
Okay, yes, and regarding your first question, the merging activity. So the current concept shown has the part-time transit lanes extending from basically just north of where congestion starts at DeLong Avenue to just south of where congestion appears to end based on all the data analysis we've done by now North San Pedro Road. So, one strategy we've identified is for express buses could merge over prior to the start of congestion and then actually merge back to the HOV lane after congestion has subsided, which should greatly improve the ease of that merging activity. Not to say it's going to be without some sort of time penalty, but that should help streamline that movement. I'm not aware of the Assembly bill or any other legislation that would modify the vehicle code in terms of facilitating bus merge movements. With regards to the second question regarding the feedback from emergency providers, CHP has been heavily involved in our TAC presentations and provide comments on all our deliverables. They have expressed significant concerns about the effect of part-time transit lanes on their operations. And that's something that isn't unique to this specific 101 project, but is something that they have expressed on all part-time transit lane projects and is currently being worked out with Caltrans and state officials. So we hope that the Assembly bill, as well as the Caltrans design guidance, will help address some of those concerns that have been raised by the CHP through the process.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any further questions? Are there any?
This is...
Yes.
This is Dick Graswell. I came on late. I'm sorry, you may have covered this, but I'm just curious, what is the timing on this? You probably covered it when I got on late. So.
No, that's a good question. So we have concluded the feasibility study portion of the project. Next step would be to pursue funding for subsequent steps. I think a concept of operations, as well as the environmental clearance and Caltrans approval would be the logical set of next steps. But because there isn't currently funding identified, it's hard to put a date on that. I don't know if Derek, if you want to chime in with any other response to that.
No, we're working alongside our regional partners to identify appropriate funding strategies for grants and other opportunities to fund the subsequent phases of the study. I think the feasibility plan identifies a potential time frame of 4 to 6 years for operations of any proposed scheme of part-time transit lanes in this corridor.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions from directors? I'm hearing none from my other directors, but I do have a question. You know, as board members on the Golden Gate Transit District, we tend to focus on the corridor to San Francisco, which is mostly southbound, of course. I wonder what the AM commute travel path is along this proposed project, and whether post-COVID travel will have any changes on the demand for a part-time transit lane in the northbound direction in the morning.
Yeah, the analysis that we conducted indicated that really the volumes do peak in the southbound direction in the morning. While there is a lot of traffic activity at other times of day in the northbound direction, it just doesn't reach the congestion levels of the southbound in the morning. We have looked at some more recent 2021 data, or really overall travel demand trends from pre-COVID through the pandemic to current conditions. And we really found that the overall level of traffic volumes in the corridor has rebounded to only be actually really slightly less than pre-pandemic conditions. The congestion may not have fully returned yet, but I think we're certainly close to that point. It's hard to say any lasting changes to travel patterns that may result from the pandemic, but I would say in terms of overall congestion within this corridor, we would expect it to at least hit pre-pandemic levels in the coming months if it hasn't already with the school reopening.
Thank
this
you.
Is Derek. This is Derek Mcgill. I just wanted to add on briefly to this. We are in a very strange period, pretty dynamic changes in our travel patterns. As school is returning this week and in the last weeks of August in Marin County, we are seeing some shifts that sort of indicate it's going to remain a pretty dynamic situation in terms of travel patterns over the next couple of months and weeks as, the Delta variant sort of works its way through the Bay Area. So with that, we're very much mindful of the COVID situation and the pandemic effects on transportation. And this corridor and this project is being eyed. It's very much in line with the Blue Ribbon Task Force transit recovery priorities, including advancing transit priority and providing pathways for buses to bypass traffic. So we are looking at this feasibility study as a potential concept to support for transit operators, both Marin Transit and Golden Gate Transit, in their recovery efforts. We expect traffic to continue to rebound at a much faster pace than transit ridership, and anything we can do to support our transit operators in getting folks back onto the bus as a way to manage congestion in this corridor is being explored by TAM and our board.
Thank you, Derek. I think, unless I misunderstood, this part-time transit lane is for northbound AM commute traffic. Is that right?
Southbound.
All right. No wonder I didn't understand what was going on. Thank you very much. We move on now to any further director questions. I am hearing none. Is there anyone from the public wishing to speak?
Chair Fredericks, I'm going to pull the public line really quick again after the presentation started, and while we were all having our discussion, a number of people jumped on, so I want to make sure that we captured everybody. So give me 1 second. Thank you for your patience. There are no speakers on this item. There will be speakers under public comment, though.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. No action is required. This is an informational report. We'll continue now to Agenda Item 5 after thanking the presenters. Item 5 is a monthly report on bridge traffic, transit, and ridership trends, transit service performance. Staff report begins on page 45. Dennis, do you have anything to report related to this item?
I'll just, the highlights are that travel still remains well down in the Golden Gate corridor, while local traffic throughout the region is getting close to normal levels. Commute traffic in particular has not. Over the course of a month, bridge traffic is still down approximately 20%. Interestingly, during the morning commute period, 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., it's down about 35%. So the travel that's occurring is not to commute into downtown San Francisco to get into an elevator to go up 20 stories in an office building. Ferry ridership is still down about 90%. Bus ridership's down about 70%. The strongest growth we've had since this report's data, which is through the end of June, is with the restart of baseball and the Giants having a winning season. So our busiest ferry boats are those that go to the ballpark as opposed to those that take commuters into San Francisco. So travel still remains well down, which obviously affects our finances. We're fortunate that MTC last month allocated American Rescue Plan funds to us because since travel is down, last week we lost $1.4 million in revenues. With that, I'm available to answer any questions that you may have.
Do the directors have any questions? I'm hearing none. That concludes the discussion on this item. Is there anyone from the public wishing to speak?
Thank you. We have no speakers on this item.
No action is required. This is an informational report. The next item on the agenda is number 6, also an informational report, monthly report on activities related to Marin Transit. A very brief staff report begins on page 51. Dennis, do you have anything to report on this item?
Yes. As an update, since the staff report was prepared, the Bridge District provides local bus service to Marin Transit under contract. Our contract expires at the middle of next year. So starting in January, we commence negotiations with Marin Transit to re-up that contract. We are apart on price currently, but we want to continue the relationship. So Marin Transit had a special board workshop on Monday, and Marin Transit's reached out to us subsequently asking that we entertain a 6-month extension, which staff strongly recommends, so we'll be bringing that forward. So we will do a 6-month contract extension through the end of next calendar year, which gives us adequate time to wrap up the negotiations and also adequate time for Marin Transit to have their options available if the negotiations don't go as they see fit. With that, I'm available to answer any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions? I'm hearing none, but I do have a question. What is the usual duration of the contract?
Typically, well, it's varied, but typically it's 5 years with a couple year extensions. We've traded different proposals back and forth. We've been operating service for them for over 4 decades. It's a long-standing relationship, and it's a symbiotic relationship. We'd like to bring back some of that in terms of the scheduling flexibility we had. But typically contracts for local fixed route service is 5 years. But they have offered a shorter term with some different hourly rates, and we'll explore all options so that we can bring this to closure.
Thank you, Dennis. Any further questions? Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak?
We don't have a speaker on item 6, but what I can do is I can roll into item number 7, which is public comment, and I can introduce our 2 speakers, if that's okay with you, Chair Frederick.
Thank you very much. Please proceed, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Dave Rohde to speak. Mr. Rohde, are you on the line with us?
Board members, managers, and staff, good morning. My name is Dave Rohde. I'm with the Climate Reality Project. I'm here this morning to talk about electric ferries. Over the past few years, when addressing this subject, I've been told that there are 2 key reasons that electric ferries are not viable for the Golden Gate Bridge District's most active commuter route from Larkspur to San Francisco. Number one, they're not big enough. 3 of your catamarans have a capacity of 450 passengers. The fourth one can hold 400. Number 2, electric ferries are not yet fast enough. They are not capable of 35 knots like your diesel catamarans are. Let's address the first issue. Your ferry passenger report today shows that in August, the average number of passengers per trip was 133. Guess what? I know of a fast electric ferry that carries 150 passengers. Now, as to the speed of that passenger ferry, yes, it's only capable of 25 knots. But here's a big surprise. Because of the various speed limits your ferries have to abide by, especially in the waters near Larkspur and near the ferry building, your catamarans are only traveling at top speed for part of the trip. An electric ferry with a top speed of 25 knots takes just 8.4 minutes longer to cross from Larkspur to San Francisco. Thanks to Jim Swindler and his crew, I was able to create a formula for ferry crossing times. I'm submitting this data in a written version of this report, which I'm sending to Amaret Kawong for the full board meeting tomorrow. The beauty of ferries like this, that Norway has been operating for over 2 years, they are not only reducing carbon emissions by 95%, their operating costs are 80% less. Imagine that, an 80% reduction in the cost of operating Golden Gate Bridge District ferries. The passenger ferry capable of 25 knots that I referred to earlier is from the Green City Ferry Company. But there are no doubt plenty more like it, bigger and faster, that are coming to the market as ferry systems around the world are going all electric, including Washington State's entire ferry system. As for the extra 8.4 minutes to cross the bay, my team and I are ready to do a survey of your ferry commuters. We have little doubt that in the face of the climate crisis, if they are presented with the option of a non-polluting all-electric ferry, the majority will continue to ride, even if it takes a few minutes longer to cross. I know I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can operate an electric ferry, you need to have charging stations at both docks, and I know that requires permits, time, and money. But I do know that in February last year, you received a federal grant of $5.9 million toward a new ferry. Why can't that ferry be electric? Why can't you start now applying some of that grant money toward the infrastructure you need to start operating electric ferries? I'm happy to turn all my research over to Dennis Mulligan's office for consideration, but it's time to do a feasibility study for electric ferries, much like the study that we heard this morning about buses using the shoulder of 101. I appreciate you listening, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohde. Is there any further public comment?
Yes, our next speaker is David Pilpel. David Pilpel, are you on the line still?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Great. Good morning, directors. So it's just a little difficult to focus today due to the Kabul airport bombing report that I heard this morning, which is very upsetting for all of us. On the other hand, shifting to good news, I recently received a notice that the San Rafael Transit Center relocation project draft EIR is now available and has been for the last 2 weeks. If I have questions or follow-up, I will direct them to the appropriate district staff. So that's good news that that's out. I was going to mention the Marin Transit Workshop on Monday. I did not tune in, but I do appreciate the general manager's summary. I was going to ask for a little highlight on that, and we got it in advance, so that was great. Thank you. I do think, without going into the details about transit scheduling, which would really bore all of you, I think, I do think that given the likely shift from our pre-COVID peak travel times at 8 in the morning and 5 at night, that's going to change, and that there's going to be less peak travel and more midday travel, and travel patterns will change. So whereas Golden Gate Transit previously had a relatively high, what's called the peak to base ratio of the number of buses in service at 8 and 5 compared to, say, 12 noon, which was, I don't remember the specifics, but it was something like 200 vehicles plus or minus in the peak and like 50 in the base, or a ratio of like 4 to 1. I think we will likely see something more like up to 150 in the peak and more like 75 in the base, which is more like a 2 to 1 ratio. Also, the average length of the runs was more like 12 and a half hours for roughly 8 hours work or less. So I think as those cost factors change, the cost of the average cost per hour of operating Golden Gate bus services, I think, is going to go down somewhat, and I think we're already seeing that now. And I think that may, and hopefully will, influence the discussions and negotiations with Marin Transit. So I'm optimistic about the district continuing to operate Marin Transit services and perhaps take back some of the services in the future that Marin Transit was operating with Marin Airport and other contractors. More on that in the future. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Perla. Is there any further public comment?
We have no further speakers.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. May I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
And a second. And I'll second that, and thank you for loving the meeting so much. If there are no objections, this concludes this meeting of the Transportation Committee. Thank you, colleagues. The time on my computer is 10:01 a.m.